Hi everyone, I'm Anna Rose. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thank you for joining us today. This is the 13th Cold War Spaces talk in our series. Today we have two guests joining us from McGill University in Montreal, Benjamin Forrest and Juliet Johnson. We'll be speaking on the subject of contested space, communist and Confederate monuments. Benjamin Forrest is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and an associate member of the Department of Political Science. He focuses on the geographical nature of identity, race, and political representation. Juliet's research focuses on the politics of money and identity, particularly in post-communist Europe. Together, they lead the Post-Communist Monuments Project, through which they research national identity in post-communist states by examining political struggles over Soviet and post-Soviet era monuments and memorials. The talk today will be a slightly longer program than usual since we do have two guests. It will be a 40-minute interview moderated by Joes Segal, the Wende's Chief Curator and Director of Programming. After that, we'll allow about 20 minutes for a Q&A. And we also have a new feature this week. We're opening up the chat box. So if you have any comments that aren't necessarily questions, you can type those in for all the attendees and the panelists to see. But please, as usual, keep your questions for the Q&A for after the interview to go in the Q&A box. As we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. And if you like, say what city you're joining in from. And afterwards this week, we'll also be sending a short questionnaire about the series to help inform our future virtual programming. So please look out for that in the follow-up email today. I'd also like to thank Susan Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And now I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. The early 20th century Austrian writer Robert Musil once remarked that nothing is as invisible as a public monument. What he meant is that in the long run, monuments go unnoticed and become a silent and meaningless part of the everyday environment. But not in times of political turmoil. The French and Russian revolutions saw a purge of public monuments to the old regimes, and the fall of the Berlin Wall and the subsequent dissolution of the Soviet Union witnessed a large-scale cleansing of communist monuments and statues. Right now, in the wake of demonstrations against structural racism and police brutality, Confederate and other monuments associated with colonialism, slave ownership, racism, and genocide are targeted in the United States and beyond. In response, the White House issued an executive order to protect these monuments, and the Department of Homeland Security employed a heavily contested special task force to this end. No one can say monuments are invisible anymore. Today, we will be discussing the toppling, removal, destruction, defacing, relocation, and replacement of public monuments, both in the post-communist countries of the former Soviet bloc and in the United States in our current moment. I'm very happy to be joined by Benjamin Forrest and Juliet Johnson, who have published and taught about the fate of communist and Confederate monuments then and now. Ben and Juliet, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thanks. Thank you. Great to be here.
Okay, wonderful. And let me start with a personal question. You both come from different disciplines, geography and political studies. What was the origin of your collaborative research into monuments? How did it start?
That's a funny story.
Well,
tell us.
Okay. Well, I had, my research, my main research has always been on the post-communist world. And when I was doing my dissertation research in the 1990s, it was on Russian banking. So my first book was about Russian banking in the 1990s. I've continued to work on central banking, but in the 1990s, of course, I was living in Moscow and then in Ryazan and then in Volgograd. And you can't be in these places in the 1990s without being struck by the importance of the symbolic landscape, the way it's changing, the discussion surrounding it. But as a political scientist, at least in the 1990s, we didn't really have a disciplinary vocabulary to deal with it. So I was always quite interested, and I was tracking what was happening, but it wasn't a part of my professional life. It was more something I was just interested in personally. And then,
well, and then when we met, I was my work at the time was on voting rights. In particular, I was interested in the way in which court decisions would talk about various political communities and the way in which race was or was not an appropriate way to draw congressional districts. But a great deal of this, of course, involves symbolic politics, not simply electoral politics. And so when Juliet, told me about all these changes to the monuments and memorials in the post-communist world, and she sort of said, sighed and said, "Oh, but of course you can't study that."
I never said that. I never said
paraphrasing.
That. I said my discipline doesn't take it seriously. That's different.
And I said, well, come over to geography because we're all about studying the landscape.
And I said, what is geography? Yeah, because my undergraduate and graduate institutions didn't even have geography departments. But of course, geographers.
Lesser universities.
Yeah, Stanford and Princeton. Thank you very much. But it was, but geographers have thought very deeply about the symbolic politics of landscapes, and so we took a lot of the theoretical ideas from geography and brought them to the post-communist context. And we did this at first in the context of thinking about what had happened to Soviet-era monuments in Moscow. And so I brought him to Moscow with me in the summer of 1999, so that we could do research together. It was, I think, your first trip.
Fascinating.
It was great.
Right. So was it somehow tricky to combine the two perspectives coming from two different disciplines, or was that a very natural process?
It was very smooth.
It was very smooth. It was a very natural process. It turned out, fortunately, we agreed on the kinds of theoretical applications and interpretations that made sense in the context, and we respect each other's disciplinary and empirical knowledge.
Right. So let's have a look at the big picture to start with. Looking at history, at what moments in time, under what circumstances have monuments been attacked? Can you say something general about it?
Well, I remember when we were first talking about this, you were saying, well, clearly this happens after revolutionary events, right? United States in 1776 with the French Revolution, 1917 in Russia, 1989 and 91 in the former Soviet bloc. So there is definitely this association of large-scale monumental destruction with revolution, but that is actually a little bit misleading. Yes, it happens then, but it happens, I would say, almost as often in circumstances that are not quite as exceptional, with kind of less dramatic shifts in political power.
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about this is that it's typical to see changes in the symbolic landscape anytime there are shifts in political power or turnovers in political power. And revolutions and regime change they're the most dramatic example, and so they're the ones that stick in everyone's mind. But you can find lots of examples of sort of undramatic or kind of routine changes in political power that affect the symbolic landscape.
So where in that story would you position the current situation in the United States?
Well,
that's for you. Regime change would be excellent.
Well, one way to think about this is that, one way to think of it is like, oh, this is, we're undergoing a dramatic revolutionary event. Now, clearly some big changes are afoot, but taking a slightly longer historical perspective, we can actually see these kind of changes going back to the 1960s. So particularly in the Southern US, the 1960s, through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, African Americans achieved significant political power for the first time in 100 years, and achieved a position where they could start pushing back against the symbolic landscape of white supremacy. And in fact, since the 1970s or so, we have seen the erection of an increasing number of monuments to the civil rights movement. To some extent, of course, more recently, you saw the removal or replacement of Confederate monuments. And so, we're clearly seeing an uptick and a wave of that going on right now, but it's not, it's not a sort of a sudden revolution. This is the result of political changes that occurred 50 years ago. It started 50 years
but it seems to me that the sheer number of cases now has been on the rise dramatically. So how would you explain that?
Well, I mean, current politics, of course, do have something to do with it. We are seeing, as I say, it's been a gradual shift, but, over the last 10 or 15 years, we have seen a significant shift in power, political power that African Americans can wield, particularly at the local level. And let us not forget, Barack Obama was president less than 4 years ago. So we're seeing manifestations at the national level. So, there's been this sort of, I think, arguably this gradual shift in power, a reduction in the kind of power white supremacists hold. But then, of equal importance, I think you're seeing a real reckoning among whites of white supremacy, a kind of willingness to reject white supremacy in the last 4 or 5 years in a way that we haven't seen previously.
Right. So what we are witnessing now is in part monuments being defaced or toppled by the public and in part by mostly local authorities. What would you say is the difference between these situations, for instance, in terms of democratic accountability, and what happens if different political levels, for instance, the local, state or federal authorities don't agree what needs to happen with a monument?
Yeah, well, this is always complicated, right? Of course, the best option is if you have open public debate that results in elected representatives at the various levels, making and implementing a decision, right? But again, that's an ideal case. It's not typical, and it's not typical for a variety of reasons. Now, in the U.S. context, it's a little bit different. If you look at regime type, if you look at authoritarian context, which we still have in some of the post-communist world, there has to be a democratic option, right? There has to be a democratic process that can be turned to. And if there's not, if the context is authoritarian, sometimes the public acting to deface or remove monuments can be the only way to speak back to the government. So that's a different kind of dynamic. But there's something relevant to that in the current situation in the U.S. as well, and that has to do with the history of political exclusion.
Yeah, well, as I said, as I mentioned before, you've got this long history of political exclusion of African Americans and other minority groups, and in a sense, optimistically, that's a kind of democratization at most levels of government. Going on. But I think in terms of, part of the question is what level of government should these kind of decisions be made at? And of course, in the US, you've got this formal federal system. So we have the federal government, the state government, and local governments. And, I think kind of in general, you want to keep decisions local. I think that's reasonable, but there are lots of exceptions. So if you're talking about a monument on federal property or a monument that was erected by the federal government, then it seems the federal government, it's more appropriate for the federal government to have a greater say, and likewise for state governments. And I think where you want to be very cautious is where you see, a state government coming in and imposing decisions on local governments, or the federal government coming in and imposing decisions on lower levels of government without regard to local sentiment.
Which we are witnessing right now, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, but I also think when you think about the public taking action, it's important to differentiate among the kinds of actions the public can take. Right. First of all, is what they're doing reversible versus irreversible? So vandalism, so spray painting something, pulling down a flag, symbolic things like that. That's reversible. Destroying a statue, that's something that's irreversible. So it doesn't mean that it's wrong, but it's a different kind of action. Similarly, is the action aimed at inclusion or exclusion. If if you go and you spray paint Black Lives Matter on a statue, well, this is saying that this particular statue does not represent an inclusive political community or polity. Whereas if you are vandalizing an anti-slavery monument, if you are writing anti-Semitic graffiti, which, as we know in the post-communist world, happens fairly often, this is quite different. It's physically the same act, but it's an act of exclusion. And so I think that difference matters a fair bit too in interpreting what is democratic and what is not.
But is that a moral judgment or is it a political judgment?
Well, they overlap, don't they?
Okay.
The moral is the political and vice versa.
Right.
And I think people who have spent a lot of time in the communist and post-communist world perhaps feel that more than others.
Right. So what do you think of the argument that the removal of historical monuments boils down to erasing history and therefore is detrimental to historical awareness? And maybe also the question, in how far do you think that monuments actually represent history? Do they represent history? Do they present a very particular perspective on history? What is your take there?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, I have a pretty strong view on this, in that I think monuments in some ways are really the antithesis of history, right? History is something, it's continually being made, it's continually being interpreted and reinterpreted. These interpretations, there's a plurality of them, there's an ongoing dialogue. I mean, historians will be the first ones to say that we're the ones, we're revisionists. If history was a set thing, all the history departments would be out of business, right? Whereas monuments are actually intended to freeze a particular moment and a particular interpretation of history in time. And again, in this sense, they're anti-historical. What they also do is they impart a very conservative bias onto the landscape, because whoever's in power at the moment decides what goes up. And then inertia at the very least sets in. It's hard to take something down once it goes up. And space and names, by the way, too, are zero sum. Once something is in a particular space, or once a building is named a particular thing or something like that, there's not another statue can't be in that spot. Another name can't be given. So monuments, the argument that removing monuments is erasing history, I think is fundamentally misleading in some quite important ways.
Yeah.
Although I think, there's also another way of thinking about this.
Yeah.
Now the memory scholar Paul Connerton draws this distinction between what he calls repressive erasure and prescriptive forgetting. And repressive erasure is that's the sort of the argument that people who object to removing Confederate monuments often appeal to. The idea that taking monument down that's erasing history, and it's repressive erasure in the way that the Soviets airbrushing figures out of history was repressive. But alternative way of thinking about taking down monuments is what he calls prescriptive forgetting. And this comes out of particularly traditions of truth and reconciliation commissions. It's a way of breaking cycles of revenge, where there's an open acknowledgement of the decision to forget. And that's a key distinction. With repressive erasure, there has to be silence about the forgetting in order for it to be effective. So that you not only erase something, you don't talk about the erasure. Prescriptive forgetting, there's an explicit discussion of something that perhaps needs to be forgotten or removed, but there's no attempt to hide the fact that something was once there. So it's a difference between taking a statue down and then denying it ever existed, and taking a statue down and having perfectly open discussion about it. Well, the statue was put up by governments who were advocating white supremacy, or who were instruments of totalitarianism. We don't agree with that anymore, and therefore we've removed the statue.
Yeah, so it's a matter of coming to terms with the past and the readiness to discuss the past.
Yeah,
In that sense, let me give you, let me mention an example, and I'm curious how you see a possible comparison with the current situation. In 1992 in Berlin, a large monument to Lenin was taken down by the city council, in spite of the fact that a local committee in their neighborhood fiercely defended the monument, not so much because they were in awe of Lenin and the aesthetics of the monument or his politics, but because they argued we want to have this symbol of our communist past in order to be able to discuss it, to come to terms with it, etc. What do you think of that argument, and is that in any way comparable to people nowadays who say don't put away these monuments, they are of historical value?
Well, we can share this one. Well, first of all, let's look at what was going on in in East Berlin, like Berlin at that moment in time, right? This is 1991, 1992, and first of all, Lenin and communism are no longer a threat. They're not coming back. So so in essence, there can be there can be some kind of nostalgia, or, well, this became in East Germany nostalgia, right? This is a fascinating phenomenon that says let's remember the past, let's remember the culture without any danger that it's going to come back. And at the same time, this is when you're having the reunification of East and West Germany. So East Germans did feel that they were losing something. They felt that West Germany was imposing a particular kind of memory culture on them. To a certain extent, this was true, and so this is also this was also a desire to hold on to a bit of their own past in that kind of environment. Now, I'll let you discuss whether or not that's a parallel with what's happening in the U.S.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are obviously some huge differences. I mean, white supremacy is not buried; it's an ongoing and perhaps rising threat. And so when you have this sort of defense, it's not a kind of nostalgia for an era or for figures who no longer have any historical relevance. These are very much part and parcel with current political conflicts.
Well, I mean, say Lenin still has historical relevance, but the communist regime is not coming back. White supremacy and structural racism are still very, very much an embedded part of the U.S. political system. So you don't see African Americans defending Confederate monuments. You don't see Native Americans defending Columbus. This is a real difference, I think.
Yeah, that's clear. Okay, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about the post-communist monuments. If you look at their fate, many different things happened. Sometimes they were contextualized in a new way. They were removed. They were put in dedicated parks or museums. Can you tell a little bit about the different trajectories here? I think you also have some very nice images to show.
We do. Pull up the slides.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And can you comment if you think that some of these treatments of monuments are better or worse?
Better or worse, and well, Ben is pulling those up. I think better or worse really depends on the particular context, right? So if you go all the way to the beginning, all the way to the beginning. Oh, look, everybody's seeing all the things. Yes, all the way to the beginning. So
we're all the way
there. So the variety of options, right? And one of them is the remove and discard. And I like this picture because this is an empty pedestal in Budapest. And I took this picture, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so. But one of the things I love about this picture, besides the guy and his dog and the graffiti, is that none of my Hungarian friends even remember what was there. So this is one option, and this is in fact what some people are recommending for the Confederate statues. You know, you remove them, you leave the pedestal, so it shows that something was there, but you don't necessarily replace it. And
then I would say, if no one remembers what was there, that seems not the best way to come into terms with the past.
It's not a great way to come to terms with the past. You have to you would have to remember what was there and why. And in this particular case, one doesn't. But there are other cases where one does. I'll get to that in a minute. Now this is one of my favorites, right? So often people who don't really know museum culture will say, well, let's just take all the statues and put them in museums. All right, sometimes you can do this, and you have some examples of this in the post-communist world as well. So here's I find this one quite interesting. This is a Lenin head that's been put in a museum in Estonia, but by the bathroom. So the placement is quite symbolic. But really what people often don't think about when they say, oh, we should just put these into museums and contextualize them. Statues are large. Museums are
they don't want the things.
A lot of them, they don't want the things. They're tight for space. And there's a lot of cost involved in moving them, contextualizing them. You could do an outdoor statue garden. I'll get to why that might not be ideal in a moment. But removing these and putting them into museums, in short, is not as unproblematic as people often seem to assume. All right, so here's the statue park option, and it's an interesting one, but I'll explain why I don't think it's actually the most appropriate for Confederate monuments. So you had the creation of 3 of these statue parks in the post-communist world. The 2 that were purposeful were in Hungary and in Lithuania. And this is the most well-known one. It's what's now called Memento Park in Budapest, where they took a lot of the statues that were in and around the city, and they put them in this location right outside of town, and again, very much contextualized them in often a kind of mocking or ironic way. And so for example, if you look at the picture of the layout, you go in the main entrance, you go in circles to see the monuments, and in the end, if you go all the way to the end, you hit a brick wall. That's purposeful, right? So this is what you had happen in Hungary and Lithuania. I don't know if is the next one. This is the next one. Okay, let me switch to whoops, back. Okay, so this is the one in Moscow, the accidental statue park. This is the way it looked in 1992, right? I took this picture in 1992, which is why it's a little blurry. So you had, after the failure of the attempted, the coup in August of 1991, you had the statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky taken down with a crane, outside of the KGB building, and that's Felix standing up on the left-hand side there. Along with a statue of Kalinin and a statue of Sverdlov. They were moving to take down the statue of Lenin in October Square, but I'd have ran out of steam, got tired, and so that statue actually never came down. But what they did was they dumped these statues in this spot, outside what is the new Tretyakov gallery. And so, over time they stood them up, they cleaned them up, they put them back on pedestals. They said, these are artistic, protected by the state, and surrounded them with other non-political statuary, like statues of things like Gandhi, or
just
abstract sculpture, things
Some
from
of
fairy tales, all sorts of things. So, but this is an accidental statue park, and it has a warning for a potential Confederate one, because there has been for years, and there's ongoing debate about putting Dzerzhinsky back in front of the former KGB building, which is now the head of the Russian secret police. The only reason you can have the conversation about potentially putting him back is because he's still available. And
Waiting
what I
for
would
a second chance.
a second chance, right?
Yeah.
And so if you do the same kind of thing with Confederate monuments, you could accidentally be creating a focal point in the landscape for white supremacists or supporters of this lost cause myth to gather. So again, something that worked very well in Hungary and Lithuania, questionable in Moscow, more complicated, I think is probably not something that would work for Confederate monuments unless it's done very, very carefully.
Although you wouldn't say, looking at this image, that these guys are being honored here.
Oh, well, this is
92.
This is 1992.
Right.
This is 1992. It looks very different now, and I don't have one of the current images,
Yeah.
but they're cleaned up. They have labels. There are no weeds. Dzerzhinsky even has his old pedestal back.
Oh, wow.
So it looks quite different now.
Yeah.
So
looking over these different options, what would your recommendation be for how to deal with Confederate and other problematic monuments nowadays?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there's any one best solution. No, I mean, I would say, I think perhaps the one possible exception for creating if not a statue park, the one argument for perhaps relocating Confederate monuments in a kind of respectful way would be for a Confederate memorial or Confederate monument that is also a grave marker. That we tend to give a great deal of deference to burial places. There's a sense of the sacred about them, and there's an argument that any monument that any memorial that is in fact a grave marker deserves a little bit more deference. And these kind of monuments, arguably could be moved to it would be appropriate to move them to a cemetery. But I think that's a fairly minor exception. And again, I wouldn't want to make that as a sort of a blanket rule, a blanket practice.
Well, that's what I'll just flip down to the bronze soldier. Oh, yes. Which is, and many of you might remember when the bronze soldier in Estonia, Central Soviet World War II monument in Tallinn was removed with great controversy, created an international incident between Estonia and Russia. But what they did was they didn't destroy the monument, they moved it to a military cemetery with Russian graves. So in that sense, they replaced it. And this is actually a picture that I took on Victory Day in 2013. And you can see how many people from Tallinn came to pay their respects. This is still in the morning, and this is the pile of carnations that were there.
Yeah, but for other options for Confederate monuments, I mean, we've already talked about the option that's often mentioned is just put them in a museum. I say that's problematic for a number of different reasons. In no short measure that museums often don't want these things. They don't want to become the dumping grounds for fraught symbols.
That depends also on the kind of museum. I could imagine that a historical museum really wants to have some of these monuments, of course not all, to make a historical point, not so much even about the Confederacy itself, but about a moment these monuments were dedicated.
Oh, absolutely. No, I'm not saying that museums wouldn't want any of them, or no museum would ever want them. But the idea that you can solve the problem by just shipping them all off to a museum, I think, is not feasible. Now, the second, second option that's probably most commonly discussed is just removing them. Remove and destroy. And this, of course, is the option that attracts the resistance, the argument that this is erasing history. These gentlemen, and hands off our history, hands off Confederate history. Mm-hmm. I think for the reasons we discussed, that may often be an appropriate response, particularly because removing them may be the appropriate response. In no short measure, because these are symbols of white supremacy, and white supremacy is an ongoing threat. Yeah, and the other one is a lot of Confederate memorials. I mean, as well as Union ones, they were put up, late 19th, early 20th century. These are mass-produced cookie-cutter monuments. They have no particular artistic value. They're not unique in any way. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of these, and so the idea that removing them is somehow going to destroy invaluable historical monuments really doesn't hold water. I'm actually a big fan of the idea of a so-called counter monument or installing counter monuments, and I think this is an option that was used a lot in the post-communist context. I've rarely seen it done or even discussed in the American context. And the idea of a counter monument is that you erect another monument, another memorial that's in close proximity. Often it's in close proximity to the original one, but the counter monument somehow challenges the original idea of the original monument, changes its meaning, introduces additional ideas. And for me, this is a really useful way of dealing with fraught or problematic monuments, because it avoids sort of the charge of erasing history. You're not taking away things from the landscape. You're actually adding to the symbolic landscape, and you're adding to them in a way that produces, if done correctly, produces a richer understanding of history.
But that means, I assume, that you have to keep the original monument. Otherwise, you only have the comment or the criticism, but not the object of the comment.
Yes,
exactly. This is one of my favorites, and sadly it is no longer. But so on the right hand side, you see the Red Army Memorial, the Red Army Monument in Budapest, and for a variety of reasons, that was not going to be removed, but still problematic in the post-communist context. So what happened was, and it's in a central square. It's actually in Freedom Square, ironically. So there was this memorial to Imre Nagy, who was the leader in 1956. Who attempted to open up the system a bit, and then was crushed. And so this memorial to him was placed, and he's on the bridge there. He's standing on the bridge. Was placed so he was standing with his back to the Red Army Memorial, looking towards the Hungarian Parliament building. So by placing this monument in this location, it changes the meaning of the Red Army Memorial and contextualizes the communist era history in some interesting and important ways. Now, the codicil to this, of course, is that the Viktor Orban government has moved that monument, has been now replaced with the Monument of National Martyrs. And if don't get me talking about the Orban government, that will get us sidetracked.
So there's a general point related to it. So what we see or have seen after the removal of communist monuments in the former Soviet bloc is that many were replaced by new symbols of national glory, for instance, in the former Soviet Asian republics, either mythical historical figures or glorifications of sitting presidents like Turkmenistan. So what would you suggest would need to happen with, given the fact that we can't put countercultural monuments next to all the Confederate monuments, what if we replace them should take their place?
Sorry, if I understand your question.
What should take their place?
What should replace Confederate monuments?
Yeah, should we keep those public places empty, or what would be appropriate instead of these monuments to put up as symbols of community or whatever you want to have there?
Well, I don't think there's any one answer to that of what should be put in place. And I think really the key to that is to think about the process that you use to decide what should be replaced. And one of my favorite examples here, I'll get to it, is this so-called Paper Monuments Project, which is based in New Orleans. Now, New Orleans, of course, removed a number of Confederate era and white supremacist monuments in the last couple of years. And so they face this question, what do we put up in their place? And so this organization, Paper Monuments, basically said, let's have broad public participation in a discussion about what to put back in their place, or more broadly, what kind of monuments memorials should appear in our public space. And so they sponsored a series of these posters. There's also, there you can see many more of them on the website, highlighting historical figures or events in New Orleans history, or actually US history more generally, kind of making a case for memorializing and monumentalizing different historical figures and different events. And I think it's that kind of broad discussion and broad participation which is key, rather than prescriptively saying we need to have monuments to X, Y, and Z everywhere.
However, we should note that there are a lot of gaps in the historical landscape in the United States, and there are gaps to African Americans, Native Americans, women, for example.
What?
I know, it's shocking. So if quick, see if you can think of a monument to a woman who actually lived and wasn't a queen, or the Virgin Mary. It's not incredibly easy. You might be able to come up with one or two. That's all right. Women are not present in public space for a variety of historical reasons. Right? If you look, for example, at Central Park in New York, right, the statues there were 22 named men, only 4 female figures, all fictional girls, and 6 animals. I mean, this is not an unusual distribution. So rather than just leaving the landscape empty, there's some historical rectifications to be made. But also, let me go back to the post-communist world to point out that,
and let's keep it short now, because
I promise I'll keep it very short.
Okay,
Very
perfect,
short.
Perfect. Yeah.
In that you also don't have to decide. So this is where the statue of Lenin was brought down in central Kiev in 2013. And the pedestal afterwards, what has happened since then is it's become a series of temporary exhibitions. First a bit rogue, and then they systematized it. So this is one of them, called Inhabiting Shadows, where people were able to climb the scaffolding and stand on top of the pedestal and see themselves in Lenin's eyes. And again, there's now a competition. There are an ongoing series of monuments, temporary monuments in that place. So you can be creative about what to do with these public spaces.
That's an interesting solution. Thank you for that. Yeah. So we are moving to the Q&A, and to all, please type your questions in the Q&A box. Try to keep it concise.
I'll stop screen sharing now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we will. I see. Yeah, we have a lot of slides that we went through quickly and/or didn't have a chance to talk about. So absolutely, we can make those available.
Fantastic. That's a great service. So the first question is by Bruce Hollihan. He writes, monuments in a political sense extol the glories of the victor at that point in time. When those who have suffered under the oppressive yoke of an erstwhile power memorials paying homage to those who in many cases paid the ultimate price with their lives. Recently visiting Berlin, I was initially stunned and then gratified at the ubiquitous presence of memorial plaques in remembrance of Jews and others who were murdered by the Nazis in the 30s and the 40s. Sadly, I do not anticipate any official memorial to those who lost their lives in the Black Wall Street massacre in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. As the balance of power changes, monuments can and will come down with the winds of change. Societal changes are like a force of nature, one which cannot be stopped easily. So that's not a real question, but a statement. And would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, and it's true. If you look, well, Germany has a very particular memorial culture that has evolved over the decades since the since World War II. But when you think about seeing monuments everywhere, reminders of the Holocaust, one of the things that you think about is the Stolperstein project. So, and this was actually this was not governmental at all. This was the initiative of one man who thought, all right, we need a way to remember the individuals who were who suffered, who were sent to concentration camps. A continuous reminder of the people who are no longer here. So what these are is they're these little brass plaques that go in front of houses or places where people used to live and did no longer because of the Holocaust. And in order to put one up, somebody has to do the research and has to pay for it. It's not just something that where the government says, okay, we're putting up this monument and now we're done. Mm-hmm. It's a part of a process. And that's the kind of thing I would like to see happen in the United States, and that truly has not happened.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I'll add to that the question, the original question has disappeared, but it mentioned the Tulsa massacre of 1921.
Yeah.
I think one response is, well, you don't have to wait for government to put up a monument. Mm-hmm. Lots of monuments began as private initiatives.
Absolutely.
Right.
And it's and can be on private land. But usually, it is quite typical that governments are not in the forefront of doing this. And in particular, in a democratic society, why should governments necessarily be in the forefront?
Well, in Germany, of course, they were in the forefront at a certain point because they wanted to come to terms. But I think it's a relatively recent phenomenon that governments actually dedicate monuments to the black pages of their own history.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, it is.
We have a few more questions. Deborah Kaufman asks, what about particular works of art from the New Deal, which are currently controversial, which depict slaves or Indians, but may be made by progressive artists?
Mm-hmm.
Well, again, I'd fall back. I don't think there's a single correct answer about what to do with them. Mm-hmm. I tend to favor very local decisions, but with the caveat that I think you have to consider the context of these murals. Were they put up to promote white supremacy? Were they put up with the intention of degrading African Americans or Native Americans or not? And are there options other than removal and destruction? Or cover-up. Again, these can be contextualized. Perhaps, in some cases they should be moved, but preserved.
Well, what about the Emancipation Monument?
Oh yeah, that's actually that's an example that's been in the news quite recently. We have a slide, but I won't put it back up. But the Emancipation monument in Washington, put up in not long after the Civil War. As far as I know, it's the only sort of national level monument that in some ways acknowledges slavery directly. But it's really focused on Lincoln. Like the iconography is extremely problematic. We've got Lincoln as the great white liberator of a slave on his knees. Again, it's not to say that that should be removed or destroyed, but that's probably not the best that we can do.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I'm going to go to the next question by Elizabeth Drummond. The Confederate monuments strike me as much less complicated than monuments to other figures. So, for example, what might we do with monuments to heroes of the Civil War who were also perpetrators of considerable violence against Native Americans in the process of westward expansion?
Yeah. Well, I think you can ask sort of the same series of questions about do the figures rise to a level, do the atrocities rise to the level where we don't want to have any presence, them to have any presence in public space, where we don't want to have any kind of semblance of honoring them, or is it appropriate to contextualize any monuments to them? And there's some actually interesting examples in the Western United States of monuments put up celebrating. They were put up to celebrate massacres of Native Americans, and a number of these have essentially been sort of recontextualized and taken over by Native American groups through a variety of means, adding context, holding commemoration ceremonies to, in essence, change the meaning of the original monument without removing it.
Okay, yeah. So I would like to take two questions together. One is by Lisa Stapleton, who asks, are you aware of any national conversations by museums in the US about what to do with these monuments? The next one is by Xenia Gorstein. I'm curious if you can talk about interesting ways that museums in the region have handled interpreting monument-like works in their collections. Museums obviously have a mandate to preserve historical objects in their collections, which separates them from municipalities or other governments without a similar mandate.
Well, there are national conversations in the U.S. among museums. There's actually a Facebook page for this, which I can find a link for and send. But yes, museums and museum curators are very actively debating not only what to do with monuments, but more broadly what to do with artifacts in their collections, particularly Native American artifacts. Or artifacts that are in their collections but were gathered in what we now consider to be highly inappropriate ways. What is the right thing to do with those? How do you contextualize those? And the answers to all of this are almost always entering into a dialogue with the groups affected. But I think I'm thinking in particular about the National Museum of American History, which has been picketed on a number of occasions now because of its because of the materials that it still holds, but also because of the statue in front. Because there's a statue of Theodore Roosevelt with a Native American and an African American to either side in indefinite, subordinate positions. And
yeah, I thought they decided to remove that.
I think they had decided to remove it, but a long time coming and in front of the National Museum of American History. About how museums in the region have done it, it varies a lot by country, as you might imagine. How they've contextualized the history. If you look at the Baltic states, for example, they have a variety of museums of the occupation, which which take a lot of these objects and very much put them in the context of, you know, this was done to us. You know, this was an alien, you know, invasion in essence, and this is how we should understand that history. It's obviously much more complicated in Russia, for example, but also in Central Asia. One of the most interesting places, you can see the slide later, is the National Museum in Bishkek, in Kyrgyzstan. So the museum is in the center of the city. Before, it was very much a museum of Soviet Kyrgyzstan. What happened, and there was a statue of Lenin in the front. So it's been a process of reinterpretation and accretion. So first they put an independence monument outside beside Lenin. Then they moved Lenin to the back. And then inside the museum, most of Soviet history is actually gone. Not all of it, but most of it. Now there's a lot of Kyrgyz, like archaeology and early history, the more traditional kind of nation and people building kinds of exhibits. But what they did keep was information about the revolution, which in Central Asia has a very different meaning, and it's wound up with national liberation, and they then skip over like Stalin, Brezhnev, pretty much everything, to and then begin Kyrgyz political history again. And on that top floor, on the ceiling, there is this amazing mural that they have not, at least last time I was there, have not yet painted over, which is a mural about it's anti-imperialism and very anti-U.S., including a skeleton with a U.S. flag riding a nuclear missile. So yeah, a lot. There are a variety of approaches.
And maybe just to one quick thing to maybe bring it back to something we talked about right at the beginning of our conversation. It's important to remember that, you know, what museums display is typically just a very small part of their collection.
Yes.
There's, like, you know, the huge sort of the backstage of museums. And so you can think of, you know, that function, the function of museums in that way, much like an historical archive, where there is, where there is kind of an imperative to err on the side of preservation, that you're preserving things for study, which is quite different than foregrounding them for display or, placing them in public space as objects of veneration.
Right. Okay, I would like to conclude, we are almost at the time, with two questions, mentioning to Citlali Sosa that we will send you the names behind the key theories that were mentioned. The first one is Lisa Stapleton, who comes back to the discussion about the Memento Park in outside Budapest, and says, seeing all of those tributes to people whose deeds were often questionable was a wonderful opportunity to contemplate their impact on history. I think that such a gathering of Confederate monuments could be similarly effective. I think you disagree. Can you once more quickly indicate why you don't think that is a good solution?
Well, a couple of reasons. First, what I said before, because this debate is still very, very much alive, and so gathering Confederate monuments in one place, especially if it's in the South, especially if it's not extremely carefully contextualized, could actually make that location a focal point for white supremacists. But also, I look at the next question from Astrid Reed. There are many people who do, in fact, remember these monuments as causing great pain.
Yeah, let me quickly read the question so that others also understand what you're mentioning. Astrid Reed writes, the kind of monuments we are discussing here, whether Soviet or Confederate, primarily serve as propaganda and to intimidate and influence the people who live amongst them. While you stated earlier that many people don't notice them or remember what once stood on empty plinth, there are many people who in fact do remember those monuments, which caused them great pain. I'm curious if you know of any research or further reading about the collective psychology of a society, of both the oppressed and the oppressors, because of the existence of these monuments in public places.
Mm-hmm. And so two things. First, this is a reason not to do it, because the presence of these monuments still does cause great pain to a lot of people. So if you're going to preserve them, you do need to do it very carefully. And what I can say about the statue parks is there's a reason that they're far outside of town. People don't have to go see them unless they want to. It's a choice. Whereas if things are in the center of town, if you have to walk by them every day, if they're near major government buildings, there is not a choice. You will experience that monument and bring to it whatever emotions and whatever trauma you have.
I was just going to chime in quickly in terms of trying to get at the psychology. I mean, I'm not familiar with a lot of that research, but one study I remember that does come to mind, looked at the psychological experiences of Holocaust survivors and the children of Holocaust survivors, or the descendants of Holocaust survivors, visiting Auschwitz. And so I'm perhaps not quite as certain that we shouldn't create a kind of statue park for Confederate monuments. I think, there may be ways, but if we think of it as sort of in the way in which Auschwitz and Dachau and the other death camps have been preserved, that clearly in a way that is not glorifying white supremacy in the way that Auschwitz is, but in no way glorifying Nazism. So I think there's a potential for that, but as Juliet said, it has to be done with extreme care.
Okay, well, we are past 1 o'clock now. So Ben and Juliet, I want to thank you very, very much for your wonderful and very insightful presentation. It was great to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. And then for next week, my guest is Eric Avila, Professor of Chicano Studies and Urban Studies at UCLA. And we will be speaking about urban space, freeway construction, and its community impact. That will be, again, a 30-minute interview followed by 15 minutes Q&A. I wish you a wonderful week and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.